Hello, and welcome to a podcast from the St Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith. This is Anne DeSantis, Executive Director, and I will be joined by the Board President of the Foundation, Mickey Kelly, for our 10 Virtues podcast, episode 4 on prudence. So I'm going to bring Mickey on with me, and he is. Mickey, it's great to see you here with us on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, and thank you for having me. It's funny with today's topic on prudence. I always thought of this song by the Beatles. I'm sure you remember that quite well growing up. I don't mean to give away your age there, but but I think this is. I have to be honest. I think this is something long overdue, and this virtue blends in very well with our podcast series, and I'm sure I'm eager to delve into this. Quite a bit. I think it's going to take. You know, I wish we could do it longer. We could write a book about this, but I digress. So,
Yes, you're right. There is so much that we could talk about. And I do want to mention to our audience, too, that Mickey and I have done quite a few other podcasts on our Philly No Nazis YouTube channel where you're probably watching this or you're watching it on Facebook. And we did a whole series actually on the cardinal virtues. So you can go to the Philly No Nazis YouTube channel to watch that. Actually, it is an audio. But though that podcast wasn't geared for those affected by divorce and separation. So this one's going to be special because we really wanted to gear it for you who either have gone through separation or divorce, annulment, or you know someone, or you're praying for people who are affected by it, or you want to get more educated on it. So I wanted to start out with the catechism reference, one of the catechism references to prudence. Okay. So prudence it disposes us to practical reason to discern true and good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. So that's very important. So my question to all of you is where does prudence fit into your life in terms of divorce and separation? Because if it isn't in your life right now, if you're not practicing it, it really is a virtue that you should be practicing. So let me bring Mickey back onto the screen and we're just going to talk a little bit more about you, about the questions that you might have about how prudence can affect you. So, first of all, Mickey, let's just talk about your own and any words that you have to say about prudence and how it's affected your own life.
yes, and I have to say, like, prudence actually is one of the, believe it or not, it's actually one of the first of the cardinal virtues because if we look at it, it's the ability to look at the concrete situation. And let's face it, I think it's lacking on all levels, whether it be elected officials, marriage, which is the subject of today. Also, too, it could be applicable in our everyday life. Say, for example, maybe you're looking at your bank statement, it's like, oh my goodness, I'm a little tight on money, and you're days away from getting your paycheck going to be like trickling in, you know, and also you just send out like wrote out checks for the utility bills or what have you. So I think it's applicable to make sure that you still had some money, to get like groceries or have money set aside for whatever. And you have to make sure, like, because next thing you know, if you don't budget your money pretty well, guess what? You're gonna have I've been there a few times myself, actually, where you're gonna get an alert from the bank saying, "Oh, there's no money, there's low money in your on your bank account," and then you're gonna be like, "Holy moly! I wish I did a better job on that part." Now, as far as prudence is concerned, with everyday life, how often do we make rash decisions, rash judgment on things where it had to be talked about? So, for example, who is going to pick up, Joey from football practice? Who is going to take Lily to her dance recital? Things like that. Those are the things that, instead of like, but then you realize like oh, I'll do it, and then you realize, oh, I had a work meeting that's going to conflict with the pickup or the drop off thing, and next thing you know, there's going to be, hooting and yelling and screaming, and hopefully this doesn't happen, but plates flying, over things that don't get, don't things don't go according to plan, or we don't really figure out like how can we come to a compromise. And I think that's something that, I think that let's face it, I think we all lack prudence one way or another. But I think what makes a difference is that we have to really, that's one of the most important cardinal virtues that have to be developed. There's actually a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas, and he puts it well about virtue when he says, "The prudent man considers things afar off, insofar as they tend to be a help or a hindrance to that which has to be done at the present time. Henceforth, it is clear that those things which prudence considers stand in relation to the end. With prudence, we look at every decision in light of the ultimate goal, that is, goodness and happiness."
Well, I'm glad you brought up a quote from St. Thomas Aquinas on prudence because it's always good to have that knowledge from the saints, especially one like him, right? And so that was great. And what I wanted to also talk with all of you about is the reference a little more about the catechism, what the catechism says about it. So if you go to the catechism under part 3, Life in Christ, section 1. Now, you might not have your catechism right in front of you, but it's basically number 1804, 1805, and prudence is 1806. If you want to know where that is in the catechism, it's number 1806. And I am going to read what it says, okay? It is the virtue that disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. That's what I said at the beginning. And it is the prudent man looks where he is going. Keep sane and sober for your prayers. Prudence is the right reason in action, writes St. Thomas Aquinas, which I believe Mickey just quoted from, following Aristotle. It is not to be confused with timidity or fear, nor with duplicity or dissimulation. It is called aurigula virtutum. Now, I might not be pronouncing that correctly, but it guides other virtues by setting rules and measures. It is the prudence that immediately guides the judgment of conscience. The prudent man determines and directs his conduct in accordance with this judgment. With the help of this virtue, we apply moral principles to particular cases without error and overcome doubts about the good to achieve and the evil to avoid. I think that last line is something we can really think about, especially for you, our audience. I always want to direct it back to you because I've said on other podcasts before that Mickey and I, admittedly, we are not divorced or separated. I've been married to my husband. Actually, we just had our anniversary. So we're married 34 years. And Mickey isn't married yet, but we're both adult children of divorce. So that's where we get that experience from knowing about divorce and separation. And also my work and Mickey's work just in the foundation and our work with talking to so many people and helping them, trying to help them. And so I think some of those questions that we could talk about, and I did mention this to Mickey before the podcast started, is what is your prudence level in terms of your decision to separate or divorce? Because you might be watching this podcast and maybe you're going through marital problems and maybe you're trying to decide if it's prudent for you to go ahead with this. And so I'd like to talk about that on this podcast. Another thing that we could discuss is your prudence level in dealing with your spouse or ex-spouse or with your children or your in-laws, your neighbors, your friends, your coworkers, people at church, and decisions about future relationships. So we want to talk about that. I do have to say before we get into that discussion that Rose Sweet is a Catholic author and speaker and coach, and she used to be on the board of directors for the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation. And she and I did a whole 12-part series, an audio podcast series, where she talked about dating, okay? And that it is important not to date until you're far away from that divorce or separation and that you have the annulment in going forward, right? So let's talk about that, Mickey, because one thing we can share is that both of our parents were divorced and that they did have to go through that annulment process. So we'll discuss that as soon as Mickey comes on.
Yes, and actually, I think you bring up a good point. But before I get into the last point you just made before I came on, and I was overhearing you say, and I think one of the things that we want to make clear is that I actually mentioned earlier about the rash judgment. And I think some people who are in the process of divorce, and I think this has been a really big pitfall for them. And of course, they practically to the point where, like, technically you're still married until you have the divorce or what have you. I mean, like, I think it's happened a lot with people that they actually go on dates when they're separated from their spouse, even before the divorce is final. That's a big flag right there because they haven't been faithful and what have you. And I think there's one thing we want to make clear on this episode is, first of all, if you are getting a divorce, do not date until it is final. If you're widowed, give it time. Just don't rush into things. That is the bottom line. Now, let's go back to the point you just made. For my parents, yes. I think most of the issues that where the divorce happened had to be on rash judgments. My dad did some things that are contrary to the church. I don't want to discuss that. I mean, he could watch this episode and realize that I betrayed him, or things like that. But, you know, I'll leave it to him and God, basically. There were times that my dad bought things that were not necessary, like a generator. And I was like 10 years old when this happened, because there was a time at the time there was supposed to be this whole hysteria called Y2K. Those of you who are listening to this may recall that the world was supposed to end at midnight 2000, but it never did, thank God. Whereas, he had to buy this generator because my dad really bought the hype, the hysteria. And I mean, how often we bought the hysteria with COVID, of course, especially as we're trying to navigate through um, that episode that happened a couple years ago. But I think also with prudence too, it's that we have to make our own decisions. We can't allow people to tell us how should we live our lives. We must use good judgment on our own accord. We can't, force people to do this or force people to do that. That's coercion. You can't coerce people into doing things. Likewise, we have to really think about some of the things that are out there. I mean, how often have we bought the hype on things that are on the news these days? How often do we, you know, how often do we understand what are things that we need? What are things that we want? Yes, we do need to be nourished, that we do need food, of course. Then, there are times every so often, maybe you're looking at your clothes, be like, oh, you know what? These are pretty old. I think I might want to get rid of them and get some new ones. Again, we have to be prudent in the way we spend and, of course, the way that we conduct ourselves.
So important. And I think this is great advice really for anybody. So if you're watching this podcast and you're not separated or divorced, or thinking about getting separated or divorced, I think you're going to learn a lot. And I do suggest, again, I'm just going to kind of rewind what I said before, is listen to the podcast between Rose Sweet and I that we did on dating, because that will answer all those questions about what is appropriate, what's not appropriate. And what it comes down to is that until that annulment happens, and as Mickey said, the divorce is final too, that the person is still married in the eyes of the church. So just keep that in mind. It's really better to heal than to try to move on too quickly. But that's not what we're going to do on this podcast, is just talk about that issue. We have so much more. But go to that series, just Philly Nonatus, and I believe it's called 12 Steps to a New Life. And it's with Rose Sweet and myself, Anne DeSantis. So going back to the catechism, because I think that's where we really learn the most about prudence, right? It talks about virtues and grace, right? God's grace is where we find the ability to find healing. And it says that human virtues are acquired by education, by deliberate acts, and by perseverance, ever renewed in repeated efforts that are purified and elevated by divine grace. With God's help, they forge character and give facility in the practice of the good. The virtuous man is happy to practice them. So think about that. when you think about prudence, you might think, "Oh, well, that's all about me not doing what I really wanna do because I'm trying to be good for God's sake." Well, that's really going to make you happy. It's really going to bring you joy in life when you follow what is good for you and your soul. Now, you're going through a divorce or separation, or you've been divorced or annulled, you've suffered. And the people that come to our foundation are usually the people who do suffer, who have gone through so much. We usually don't get people who are, sometimes you hear about those people who get divorced that are really thrilled because they just can't wait to get away from their spouse for whatever reason. Now, we know there's issues that have to do with, you know, being abused and those kind of things. We're not talking about that. We're not talking about people who have to get away from a really abusive spouse and it's a terrible situation. We're talking about people who don't get along and decide they want to move on with their lives. And maybe the spouse or ex spouse is not an abusive person, but they just want to move on. But we need to take prudence in everything we do and every decision that we make. And there's a certain prudence also that comes even with dealing with our kids, right? Dealing with our parents, our neighbors, our coworkers, and how much you want to share about your situation. So I don't know if Mickey, if you and I want to talk about that, because there is a certain aspect of people who get divorced and separated that they're dealing with not just their spouse, but they're also dealing with their ex mother in law. They're dealing with their, maybe their ex sister or sister in law or sister in laws, I should say, brother in laws, other people, neighbors that they used to live in the same neighborhood with, and maybe they're not living there anymore. So there's a certain prudence about what to share and what not to share. So I don't know if we want to talk a little bit about that.
Hmm. Well, I think one of the things that we have to, as part of prudence, is that we have to understand that, well, we do want to. I think the end game here is that we have to surround ourselves with people who will want to build us up, not tear us down. That's what's important. And prudence, of course, let's face it. I mean, in the aspect of separation, divorce, is, let's face it, like, there are spouses who don't get along very well with their in-laws. I've seen it. In fact, my mom does get along with her ex-in-laws. They would laugh, they would have a drink, they would, reminisce about the good times, laugh, smile, enjoy, you know, my mom's cooking and what have you. And then you're gonna have those, like, I mean, I'll put it this way, like, my parents, they've got along pretty well despite the divorce with their in-laws, so to speak. And they got to the point, also too, I think another thing that and of course you and I talked about this before, and I think I shared this in some of the previous podcasts, and is that, at first my dad and my stepdad did not get along very well when it came to, you know the friendship. Um, like, it was awkward, it was, bitter at first, but it got to the point where, they realized, they practically needed each other, and they built a friendship. Like, every week they would meet up, have a coffee or delicious, continental breakfast or what have you, and catch up on the things that happened the past week or two. It got to the point where my dad actually invited my stepdad to go, target shooting, like, around the holidays, basically between Christmas and New Year. He was invited to go out because my stepdad served in the Marine Corps, so he knows how to handle a weapon, of course, but he declined, and he actually, you know, actually heard a story, after the fact, how, my nephew, was like really precise on his, when he was, like, on his target shooting, so to speak, and same thing with my brother Dominic. So, I mean, I think you just never know what will happen. I mean, there's like a blessing in disguise, so to speak, how I saw, like, with my dad and stepdad. I mean, to be truthful, I don't think there was any, physical confrontation. I think it was more like a war of words, so to speak. But, thanks be to God, like, nothing, no bad blood, no, nothing out of like a true crime script, so to speak, happened. And, things kind of progress there. I mean, let's face it, there's not everyone gets along with their ex-in-laws, and there's some that do, and some that don't. And then you have times where there are people that the spouse knew that don't like the one that they married, out of and most of the time it's for petty reasons. But I think for prudence is that, first of all, we still have to pray for those people. And secondly, you have to ask yourself, like, do I really want to associate with this person whatsoever, or should I just break away? And I think it's going to take some prayer and it's going to take some discernment to decide what do you want to do when there's people that want to try to pull you down. Do you want to keep going, or should you distance yourself? And there's nothing wrong with cutting out toxic people in your life. And you probably see a lot on social media, like it's okay to cut out toxic people because the last thing you want to do is you want them to inflict harm on your mental well being. And you don't want that, as well as your spiritual too.
Yeah, they're really good points. And I'm glad you brought those up about like toxic people because in the foundation, honestly, we do hear a lot about that. We hear a lot about people who have just really sometimes even horrific kind of relationships with ex-spouses or even people that they knew from the past. And so the Lord doesn't wish for us to be doormats, does he? And so we need to pray. And I think a big part of prudence is the fact that what we really need to do is take those decisions that have to do with your divorce, separation, annulment, your children, the people around you. Take it all to prayer and take it all to the Blessed Mother, too. Pray to the Blessed Mother and ask for her intercession. Ask for her to help you to make right decisions in terms of your family life, in terms of your future. And there was one more article that I wanted to refer to. And this is from the Catholic News Agency. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but one of the things it says in this article, which is just entitled Prudence, that's all it's called. And it's by, it says, or smart living. It says, prudence is the first of the cardinal virtues because it is the ability to look at a concrete situation and know what has to be done. It is the ability to make right judgments. Prudence gives us the knowledge of what must be done, when it must be done, and how it must be done. There is often great misunderstanding about the real nature of prudence. And then it just goes on in the article to give some examples, which I'm not going to read all of those. But I love the way they express that. It's about what needs to be done, when it not needs to be done, how it needs to be done, right? And we always want to err on the side, obviously, of charity in all that we say and all that we do. And that doesn't mean, like Mickey said, like in dealing with, like, say, toxic people and having to put distance there, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do, sometimes you have to do things like that. But prudence gives us that ability to do the right thing. And I'm just going to read again what I said at the very beginning of the podcast is that it disposes practical reason to discern our true good in every circumstance and to choose the right means of achieving it. So, if you are going to be getting divorced or separated, and you do feel that this is what's going to be happening to you and your family, you need to take the proper, correct steps for yourself in terms of reaching out to the Catholic Church, right? Because you're ending, obviously you're having your marriage examined to see whether was everything right when you were married, because that decree of nullity is what you get when you get an annulment, and that means that something was not right from the beginning in your marriage. Now, this is not the time or place for me to talk a long time about annulments because this podcast is about prudence. But I do want to mention to you that on our website and on our YouTube channel, I'm happy to tell all of you that we did a 4-part series on annulments with Father Matthew Phelan, who's the vicar of the Mercedarian order who founded us, and also a priest named Father Sean Bransfield, who's with the Archdiocese of Philadelphia. The three of us got together. Now, it was a few years ago. It wasn't done, recently, but all the information that we shared on that podcast is still very relevant. So just go to our website at nonatus.org under For the Divorced. At the bottom of the page, you'll see a link to that four-part series on annulments. or you can simply go to the Philly Nonnatus YouTube channel where you're probably watching this podcast, and you will see on the playlist the annulment series. So, Mickey, I didn't know if you had anything to say about that because, you and I both have that experience in our families where our parents both had that annulment, which if someone is going to get divorced, it is something they want to look into, isn't it?
Well, absolutely, yes. So and of course, I understand with the annulment, Pope Francis actually was trying to help a lot of those affected by divorce to, speed up that annulment process, which I think has held them up to the point where they want to try to move on from the broken marriage to a new one. Hopefully, it becomes a lot more fruitful and prosperous. I would say that it is one of the most important things to do in order for you to move on. It's I don't think it's not nerve wracking. It's nerve wracking when you don't do it. That's what I'm going to tell you. But I would say there's a lot of benefits to like get that annulment, and it's really a way for you to try to this close out a very haunting chapter of your life. So that way, there you could move on to the next thing.
Yes, Mickey, so well said. I think it's good that we addressed it on this podcast because obviously this podcast is for Catholics affected by divorce and separation. And we always say that, that could be someone who's contemplating separating. It could be someone who's divorced or got divorced years ago, or someone who wants to find out about annulments, or someone who was divorced and separated many years ago, but you still want to find some healing. I think we all need healing in our lives, don't we? And so before we end, I just want to thank you, Mickey, for such valuable information. It's great to be able to have a podcast with you because we're able to really go back and forth with our ideas and be able to cover so much. So thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.
And don't forget to watch us next month because we premiere on the first Tuesday at 8 p.m. on the Philly No Nonnatus YouTube channel. And I want to encourage all of you to please do make your pastoral appointment with us. We do free pastoral consultations with a Mercedarian friar. They're the people who founded us. All you need to do is go to nonnatus.org on the Our Services link, and you will find it there. So thank you all again, and we will see you all here next month with the St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation 10 Virtues podcast. See you then. The St. Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for Freedom, Family, and Faith was founded in 2015 by the Mercedarian Religious Order with a mission to make pastoral outreach to families in crisis. The friars came together after attending the World Meeting of Families in Philadelphia with hopes of creating a foundation which could help those families and individuals who have faced tough times and need to know that the Church cares and is there to help. Since that time when we were founded, the Foundation has helped hundreds of families by offering prayer, priestly consultations, podcasts and videos, and programs and events. Whether it is something to do with divorce or separation, trauma, job loss, loss of a loved one, relationship issues, or other crisis, the Foundation has seen lives transformed through the services we provide. Pope Francis has referred to our world as a field hospital, where there are a great deal of individuals and families who feel abandoned and they need the special outreach of those who truly care and wish to show the face of God to others. As a foundation, that is what we do every day, and we're grateful to people like you who help to make a difference for families in crisis. Please pray for us and for our mission. Would you consider a one-time or recurring gift? Please go to nonnatus.org to donate. Thank you sincerely from all of us at the St Raymond Nonnatus Foundation for freedom, family, and faith.